Faith in a Fresh Vibe podcast. I am Rohadi, coming at you from Treaty 7 lands in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. In this episode, part 2 of a 2-part series with Tony Snow. Tony comes from a line of chiefs, the original treaty signers on Treaty 7, so I'm lucky to have him on this podcast. You can check out part 1. That's going to help give you context. Season 1 also included an interview with Tony, so check that out as well. In this episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about the work of the Ecumenical Council that happened on Treaty 7 land over in Morley. It's important because there are lasting pieces about that council. And not only that, we're going to get a glimpse of Indigenous spirituality here. And that's particularly important in the context of the Christian faith because most of us have been formed in a white European gaze through a lens of those types of theologians, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but it's certainly exclusive. What does it mean to reimagine the Christian faith by processing it through a different set of lenses of how we can see and understand the world? Tony gives us a sense of where we're at in our world right now in the present day, the kind of work of reconciliation and what can happen and the hope and the dream to come. He speaks about his emerging Indigenous church plant in the urban core here in Calgary. And we talk a little bit about decolonizing the Christian faith, which is a preview of the next couple of episodes. So listen to part 1 and enjoy this one. Is there an autobiography on Henry Bird?
There is. It's called Sacred Feathers.
Sacred Feathers.
Yeah.
I mean, if he was a white dude,
Yeah.
I mean, there would be championing him and you'd probably be a saint.
Yeah.
You made a comment about the work that you're doing now is work that your dad could not do. Mm-hmm. Given the cultural climate then. Certainly things have changed since then, 40 years since that initial work about that?
Yeah.
What makes you think that it could happen today?
I think there's a greater awareness and understanding. There's a push towards reconciliation and that type of talk that was never heard back in the 80s, 90s. Mm-hmm. A lot of it just coming out of the 70s protest movements and different things that were going on. That act of rebellion. So a lot of it was couched and silenced within the community and about in our neighboring communities. So we didn't hear a lot about some of those good acts that were being done. And there's not a lot of people willing to listen. Whereas now I think groups, especially from this baby boomer generation, I don't know if it's either regret or something that's going on with their sort of psyche around that, but there is a real attempt, I think, to try to understand, if only to understand. I think that next level of understanding comes in with a more millennial and different population that actually does the work, that actually would be carrying forward some of those ideas and willing to engage and learn. Whereas a lot of the older generation, I think, are kind of set in what they're doing and have not had a great deal of change enacted by that group. I think they're trying. I think there's a real honest effort by some, and there's still a lot of holdovers from racism and colonialism and feelings of fear and anxiety around giving too many rights away to Indigenous people kind of thing, that they're wary of where it goes and what their responsibility, what it will look like ultimately at the end of the day with either paycheck or something that's going on. How much are we really asking for? So that, to me, is sort of the barrier on that one hand. But on the other side, for the younger generation, for people who really have grown up without the context of this colonial approach really being top of mind, people who have grown up in multi-ethnic and diverse schools and in diverse classrooms have a much different interpretation than the older generation that grew up in very segregated conditions.
So the obvious pushback to that is when you have a bunch of, we'll just, carry on with the term millennials who are figuring out not merely how to be woke, but you're going to do something about that.
Yeah.
The power holders, particularly the power holders in the institution, are still the same.
Yeah.
Or the baby boomers, or perhaps they're not, but it strikes me as the power holders have not shifted. And so how, within institutional boundaries, how would you enact that change? Like, I like the hopeful narrative. I think you're right. There's absolutely culture shifts, no doubt.
Yeah.
Even the work that I'm doing, it's not work that my dad would have done, right? But when it comes to dismantling power structures, it has to be dismantled, doesn't it, in order for some of these ideas to actually push through within institution?
I think, they do have to be sort of radically revised, because you cannot build a system on the faults of that previous system. It's always going to have a weakness. And if we don't address sort of structurally what is holding it all together, for a large part, especially within Christianity, a large part of that is white supremacy.
Yeah.
And that's what's holding a large context of that thinking together.
Yeah.
Being able to be in a all homogeneous community, in security, in fellowship, and in harmony with one another makes a lot of sense to them. But it's not seeing the limitations of that. Whereas this branching out and development of diverse communities and diverse languages, diverse understandings, even diverse religious practices, is exactly what sort of the gospel, what Jesus was doing. It's like trying to build us into a community that's more flexible and understanding, and that we're not so beholden to right ways of doing things, but actually adaptive ways of doing things that will ultimately bring us closer together.
I mean, it's certainly the gospel of a very nature is this subversive gospel. It's this subversive culture that is coming up from behind and not necessarily usurping power, but is showing a different way. I'm still skeptical that the hope and the work of change can be done within the institution. So you're saying that of course there has to be change within the institution,
and you will always have those gatekeepers and those people who, even younger millennials, who would sort of reinforce that system, and people who are of sort of a conscious effort to maintain status quo, and yet those barriers, those conditions need to be questioned and broken down to really understand why we're doing what we're doing.
So that can they be broken down?
I think they can be questioned. I think they can be tested. And I think that is the work of the church today. I think that if we look at things like online or virtual churches, where those movements away from rigid dogmatic, you got to sit in the pews and you got to not drink your coffee and do your time for your hour that you got to be there, to look beyond that, to say that there's a much more flexible way of reaching out, and there's a much more adaptive message that needs to happen in order to get people to understand and ascribe to what you're telling them, and how the world that we live in right now is not ideal and needs some direction, leadership, and change. And the more that we can do to work towards that collectively is something that is going to be a benefit not only to us and to our communities, but to those around us and those that will benefit from that type of thinking. So the more that we do work in that is the more that we can change and shift those understandings of sameness and of security and comfort that people have in their regular routine. I think people get bored of routine a lot and need to really change it up in fundamental ways. We're looking for those inspirations that will help us to make life meaningful again.
I wonder how many people prefer no change because it's safe. The sameness is safety.
As long as they're benefiting from it, they are quite content to be part of that and be oblivious to the injustices that go on around them. Once it sort of affects them, then they're reaching a point of destabilization. And at that point, then can be reached with sort of that shock of reality of this is what it is, and this is why it's sort of built into that system, and how it's affecting other people other than this person, because then they actually have to reflect outside themselves.
So you would suggest that culturally right now we're in a period of that destabilization?
I think we're in a big shift, apart from the answers that had traditionally held, as we have a group of very like-minded baby boomer generation that carried on a way of doing things that said, okay, you get married at this age, you get your house, you get your car, you get career, you retire, all this sort of thing, and then you're dead. After that process, for them, it really doesn't apply to anybody else. It really doesn't apply to those of people of my generation, so the Gen X generation. Would never happen that way for us. And then for that generation that follows, that has to deal with all of the fallout of climate change and of industrial waste and all this sort of the problems that are coming up. So it's a very different world each time. And so that one model that we thought was eternal and there forever about progress and change and success doesn't apply to really anybody.
I can see that the pushback to what is tiring, which is good, but exhaustive work trying to shift paradigm within the institution.
You made me tired just talking about it.
We're exhausted right now. And I've seen this in some of the Gen X crowd who have been engaged in this work since maybe the 80s, have come out of it and said to the ensuing generation, don't waste your time, don't waste your life trying to decenter whiteness. Go and do your own thing. Maybe not your own thing, but go and do, but it could be your own thing, but go and spend your life, your time, in particular your energy, creating something that's not going to consistently try to strip away you and your identity.
Yeah. And I think that part of that is true, that the idea of being anti-whiteness, anti-colonial and that sort of thing is a particular stance that takes on some of that faulted behavior of trying to change other people into what we need them to be, trying to, it's converting is what it is. And that to me is a challenging point to step into versus working on yourself and being able to present those opportunities and influences that come from you rather than from your hope that someone will do something differently and be different after that. I don't think that we've ever sort of gotten to the point where we're able to fully change the way another person thinks or acts, but we can sort of predictably choose to do those acts that will help to bring about at least our own appreciation.
So why not third way? Let go back to the Indigenous church plant right now, operating within bounds of institution, but there's, I would say, opportunity. Have you broached the possibilities of this thing doing its own thing?
Yeah, and it does exist there. It does exist as an independent practice, and has long been in our community in Morley shunned from sort of the institutions and had operated below the radar for generations. I know that one of my friends who was in school early on, like grade 2 or 3, and then was never there again, had been taken by his parents and trained in our traditional teachings. And because of that, didn't grow up learning to read and write and all that sort of thing, forgot how to do all that stuff, but was very adept at understanding traditions, prayers, songs, had all kinds of wisdom and all kinds of knowledge. And so he didn't fit into the mold of a regular employee, but ended up having to work with him and had a real appreciation of the types of knowledge that were important for that family and for that community in how they wanted to practice and respect what they had been holding most dear. So the more that we learn to understand and respect those differences, we're not particularly given to creating whole new cultures out of whole cloth. We are always in transition towards something else. I think the more that we can base those on foundations of principles like those teachings of our elders, which are the same teachings that Christ had about loving your neighbor, about respecting your elders and being a help to the community rather than someone who thwarted the community. The more that we can live out those principles of being a help and being productive, then we can find a balance between these differing ideologies and differing spaces, because those are perspectives on living. They aren't living.
So you would say that, would you say that you have culturally inherited then a way to live in both worlds?
To an extent. I think it's very difficult to try to do both. I think it's very difficult to try to maintain the integrity of both. You're always going to slip up, and you're always going to be subjected to different systems and different rules within different environments. And you always have to constantly switch that register to, am I here talking to elders, or am I here talking to magistrate in a court setting or something? So if you find a way to balance who you are in these spaces, one of the things that we do in our traditional teaching is to talk about our centering, and centering around the medicine wheel and those teachings, and beginning in the east to where the sun comes up, where we begin the day, where we begin the light of the world. And so information, knowledge comes into the world, and we begin. So this is your life. This is the springtime of our season, reaching an apex of the sun, going to the highest point, which is usually in the south. And that becomes the high point of our lives, the maturity, the summertime. Then going down and descending into the other end of the spectrum here in the west, where we have the sunset, we have rains, we have the winds coming in, that the realm of what is called the thunder beings. And then that's the daytime, that's your life. The other side of it is this night that half of our lives live in. And so from the north, we talk about things like the snows that come, or the northern lights that are our ancestors dancing. And so coming back all the way around from the north to the east again, and this big cycle that we live in. And so to center ourselves in the middle of that, traditionally they say, you put in the center that which is most precious. So we put our heart, our mind into that center. And we, in centering ourselves, also look up to the heavens, to the stars, where we believe we came from as Sioux people, and below to the earth. So there's this 7-point configuration, and we're right in the middle. And so that makes us the center of that understanding. If we can get to that center, and begin to understand that from this position, from this point, we engage in all other things around us, but we remain centered, then we have a better chance of understanding how we are to act, how we are to engage, how we are to live out our lives in relation to the things around us that we really can't control.
What do you see, and what is your hope for the ensuing generations to pick up some of this work?
I think that at one point I thought that it was sort of falling off the wayside. Having gone to some of the studies and to practices in Winnipeg and other areas where you're meeting with people on the street who are Indigenous heritage, who don't know or haven't been involved with their communities, had grown up completely apart from them, and so haven't had any context about what a Indigenous way of thinking is, or why things are the way they are. And so having a very tough time dealing with their environment around them, and feeling sort of abandoned into that and lost. And so from that perspective, and the youth that come out of that, which is a large portion of our Indigenous communities today, something like 80% of the Indigenous people live in urban centers now, versus on the reserves. And on the reserves, primarily you have young people. Largest populations are under 20 right now. So for the next upcoming generation, we're going to have a large influx of Indigenous people into leadership and into community structures, and who have not been given a great education, who have not been given a lot of the tools, have been sort of disenfranchised from their cultural customs and things like that. Now we're dealing with a situation of there are communities coming up that are going to be in distress. And how are we going to deal with that? Because there's a lot of addictions, a lot of FAS, a lot of social ills that are going to come to rest upon the society. And that has to be dealt with from a cross-cultural level, but also interculturally, in how we deal with a fixing of our cultural way of thinking, of our norms. And so with the recent generation and the people that, from my family and from others, turning back to some of the traditional teachings, not being so much interested in Christianity as they are in the traditional teachings, our ceremonies and things like that, to be aware and understanding. I think we always talk about a great connection between this world and the next world, this world and the spirit world, and that our traditional ways of thinking come from that dialogue between those worlds. And so as long as we maintain that connection and understanding, we'll always have sort of a foothold of where we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to do. So where I would have been more concerned about the direction of some of the youth, especially in the urban centers, and how they are dealing with issues of alienation, isolation, poverty, mental illness, and different things like that, addictions, that there is some hope coming from those that are engaged in cultural teachings and cultural understandings, those that are hungry for that type of perspective in the world, versus those that have completely shut off from that. And so we have to encourage those teachings and those ways of thinking in order to balance people for the future. Not balance just people, balance families, balance communities, so that they can exist into the future. Because the more that they turn away from their cultural teachings, the more that we turn away from the ways of knowing, that just leads to a fracturing of that psyche, a fracturing of that personality, a fracturing of that community. So it's very difficult to come back from those challenges once that has started to occur. But I think that more and more what I'm seeing from younger generations is a great hunger for the traditional teachings in a spiritual way of knowing the world. And not just from our Indigenous communities, but from the non-Indigenous community as well. I think they feel that same need.
If you have a sense that then this work, this idea, this emerging church plant is but one piece in filling that gap.
I think it's one piece in because I mean, if we do just one thing and we leave it at that, they'll think, oh, we'll just shuffle everything to the side and throw everybody over there, and that'll be fine. Into an Indigenous church, and then the Indigenous church can survive on its own if it can. But I think that we need a more integrative approach on bringing those Indigenous teachings into Christianity, into the churches, into
the dominant church.
Yeah, and to inform.
That's a critical piece. I think that we should highlight is not this notion of Indigenous people doing their own Indigenous thing off to the side for other Indigenous folks, and it'll just be this Indigenous thing. But it's a picture. It's a dream even that all minorities, in a way, have been taught to believe is that you can't lead in your own voice. You can only lead when you can adopt dominant cultural trends. If you look wide enough, then you can lead in wide spaces and talk wide enough and sound. So what you're saying about not merely Indigenous church plant for Indigenous people, but an integrative approach. This is a call to say that actually Indigenous people, our expertise is good enough to be at the forefront, which is not always what people of color or minorities have been built to think.
Yeah. And that was the teaching coming out of the ecumenical conference, saying that it is now our time to take our lessons out and to start teaching and to start bringing those that information to light, because it has a great application in the world that we live now. And part of that instruction was it's not just meant to give us a soapbox to stand on, but it is a way of getting involved and helping to steer the ship and to bring along other voices, because that's how we work. That's how we develop. That's the entire consensus model, is that to work within a community will to do the actions that make the most sense for that community.
And that act in itself is an exercise, I think, in decentering power, that you show up and you, now I would use the term you lead, but would you say that a better term would be you come in to teach? Because when you lead, then suddenly it may look like unless you're leading in a moment, but it looks like you're working outside of that kind of consensus approach that you mentioned.
I think a lot of it is we don't like to be at the forefront of things. I don't like to
as like
be
a Canadian thing, or
to stand up and say, well, this is all me and I'm so great and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But to say that we are here to help guide and we are here to help support.
Yeah.
And to direct as much as we can, given what we've learned and given that our perspective is different.
Yeah. At least it's a leadership. It's a reciprocal leadership in that here's my expertise and I will live and learn from yours. And
what we do for the traditional land use studies is often we'll bring in a map and we'll talk to elders and we'll talk about certain histories and certain stories within particular areas. And someone will say, oh, we used to go here and we used to do this and that. And another one will say, oh, this is where we had this story and blah, blah, blah. And someone will say, this is where such and such an event happened. And so there's a connection here between this and some other mythological story. And so by doing that, we're creating that mosaic of understanding. And by encouraging those voices, we're painting a picture and filling in a lot of gaps. It's like a puzzle. And as we put it, everybody puts in their piece, you start to see the whole. And so that's typically what we see for traditional land use, is that no one has one whole, complete, definitive story about an area. everybody will have been given a certain piece. When they bring that together, that's when the community awareness and community understanding builds, and they can start sharing from there, because that leads to other things.
Tony Snow with the third part of a 3-part series. The part 1 was in season 1 of the Faith in the Fresh Vibe podcast, and this is the second of a 2-part series in season 2. You might have picked up some pieces there at the end as he was talking about the ecumenical councils that took place in the 70s, just outside of Banff in Morley. The legacy of that council was predominantly, almost exclusively Indigenous. It's something we still participate and see up until this day. The National Indigenous Peoples Day is something that came out from this council. So there's a rich history here and also a different perspective in many ways right underneath our noses, particularly if you come out of a context of a Christian but also Canadian context. The reality is there are stories in your space and place. On the land that you sit on, there are similar stories of the first peoples who ventured along those lands. Hopefully some of them are still around to offer some teaching of how to reorient ourselves back to land-based education, back to the land. That is one facet when it comes to the process of decolonizing the Christian faith. Decolonizing as a word to say that most of our Christian faith in the West has been centered around white European lenses. That's how we see the world. That's how we interpret our faith. Is there another foundation where we can springboard from and come out with different perspectives of the same scriptures and the same faith? In order to do that, we need a different kind of lens. And Tony presented pieces of that and a notion that if you have ideas, if you are a minority, a person of color, that the view that you have of the world and of faith counts. Not only that, you can operate at the forefront of the church to help reimagine what is coming next, and not only for yourself, but for those who are coming in behind you as well. Thanks so much for tuning in for the Faith in the Fresh Vibe podcast. I was teasing here now the next iteration, which will include a deeper dive on decolonizing the Christian faith and racism, prejudice, all those fancy things of power systems in play in culture and also in the church. How do we get out of them? How do we press forward? How do we even notice them to begin with? You want to stick around for that. It's coming up next. I'm Rohadi. Come and find me on the social medias, on my website, and on Cypher Church's website.